Hello and welcome everybody to session 2 of this research seminar on the Port Askaig Formation of the Garvellach Islands and Islay in Western Scotland. My name is David Webster. I'm the meeting secretary of the Geological Society of Glasgow, and the Society is honoured to be hosting this event on behalf of the Cryogenian Subcommission. Here is a summary of the overall programme for the seminar. There are 4 sessions, 2 on the Wednesday and 2 on Thursday, with a live Q&A at the end of each session. All the presentations were recorded, so this video is compiled from the respective recordings, and the live Q&A sessions have been added at the end. Apologies, but sessions 1 and 2 only have a recorded audio track, whereas sessions 3 and 4 have a video track along with the audio. Before we start the session, I'd like to quickly introduce the team giving you the presentations over the 2 days. Session 1 started with a drone video shot by Jordan Mertes and narrated by Doug Benn. Jordan Mertes was until recently a postdoc fellow at the Centre for Environmental and Climate Science based at Lund University in Sweden and is an accomplished drone pilot. Doug Benn is a professor of environmental change in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development at the University of St Andrews. He's worked extensively on the modern glaciations and their applicability to the Near-Proterozoic record. You then heard from Tony Spencer, Ian Fairchild and Roger Anderton. Tony first came to Islay and the Garvellach Islands during his doctoral research at Liverpool University in the early 1960s. Geological Society of London subsequently approved a special publication, The Late Precambrian Glaciation in Scotland, which was published in 1971. Tony's career turned in a different direction after this, to more offshore geology with stints with both BP and Statoil and in various parts of the globe. He retired in 2012. After which he turned his attentions back to the Garvellach Islands and has since led a multidisciplinary team aiming to produce a new memoir in 2023. Ian Fairchild is Emeritus Professor at the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He has broad interests in the geochemistry of the Earth's surface, climate change and Quaternary and Near-Proterozoic Earth history. His PhD was on the Bonnehaven Formation of Islay, which lies directly above the Port Askaig Formation. And we have Roger Anderton, who has worked extensively on the sedimentology and tectonics of the Doradian, following his PhD on the Doradian of Islay, Jura and Mid-Argyll. And he now lives near Loch Gilphead in Argyll, following a career at the British Geological Survey, Strathclyde University and in the oil industry. Session 2 includes Doug again and presentations from Richard Waller, Mike Hambry and Dilshad Ali. Richard Waller is a senior lecturer at Keele University. He studied geography at Oxford, followed by a PhD at Southampton on debris-rich basal ice, and then a postdoc research fellowship in glaciology at Greenwich, before taking up his current lecturing post at Keele in 2001. Mike Hambry is a professor at the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences, University of Aberystwyth. Recently he led the development of the Climate Change Consortium of Wales, a partnership of Aberystwyth, Bangor, Cardiff and Swansea universities. Mike's research interests are strongly field-focused and include structural glaciology, Cenozoic glacial history of Antarctica, the Quaternary glacial history of Britain and the Proterozoic glaciations of the High Arctic. And Dilshad Ali recently completed a PhD on the Port Askaig Formation, supervised by Dan Laheron at Royal Holloway, University of London, and is currently a lecturer in the Department of Geology at Salahuddin University in Erbil in Iraq. Sessions 3 and 4 include presentations from Bruce Lavelle as well as from the others in the team. Bruce is a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. He previously worked for Royal Dutch Shell for 35 years, ending up as Chief Geologist, VP of Exploration New Ventures and VP Emerging Technologies, including leading research into scientific and business ideas for Shell's new suite of investments in renewable energy. His research interest is in sedimentary basins, and he's particularly interested into the extent in which preserved portions of the geological record are representative of the full sequence of geological events and depositional conditions. So that's the team. We're now going to go on to the second session, which concentrates on the glacial geology. We'll first hear from Doug Benn discussing the evidence for grounded and floating ice, followed by a joint presentation from Richard Waller and Mike Hambry on periglacial geology. This is going to be followed by a short presentation by Dilshad Ali on the complex events that can be identified within one particular diamictite bed, and then we'll go on to the Q&A.
Hi, I'm Doug Benn, and in this talk, I'm going to be talking about our recent work about the glacial geology of the Port Askaig Formation. Now, the glacial origin of the Port Askaig Formation was first proposed back in the 1870s, but since then, debate has gone backwards and forwards between different views as to exactly what kind of processes were responsible for the deposition of the rocks and what the implications were for environmental change. The basic stratigraphy of the succession was worked out by Kilburn, and they discussed various possibilities for the origin of the rocks. Tony Spencer's subsequent highly detailed work established a great deal of the knowledge base that we now have, and also discussed the origin of the rocks in terms of available models at that time. And he put forward the idea that there were multiple advances and retreats of grounded ice recorded in the succession. Now, this view was challenged by Nick and Caroline Isles in the 1980s, who reinterpreted the entire sequence as marine, with the diamictite beds recording processes such as rain out and slope failures and so on. So it's a glacially influenced succession, but not recording the presence of glacier ice at the locality, and therefore providing a challenge to the idea that there was climatically driven advances and retreats in the succession. And the opposing views between grounded ice versus a marine succession were laid out in a paper by Emmanuel Arnault and Ian Fairchild in 2011, just presenting these two opposing views. Now, in recent years, guided by the steady hand of Tony Spencer, we've been re-examining the entire succession, particularly on the Garvellachs Islands. And we've been able to make repeat visits over many field seasons, visiting the sections with multiple colleagues and discussing the observations and what they mean. A great advance in our ability to record these rocks came when Jordan Mertes came on board with his drone flying and data analysis skills, which allowed us to do highly detailed surveys of the rocks, allowing us to look at both the fine detail and the larger scale architecture of the exposures at the same time. And including other information, geochemical information and so on, we've been able to build up a very detailed picture of the structure of these rocks and their significance. Now, on the Garvellachs Islands, there are 38 numbered diamictite beds in members 1 to 3. And these actually represent quite a wide range of different facies, and in association with adjacent beds, sands and gravels and so on, siltstones, they record a variety of environments that changed through time. And in this talk, I'm going to put forward the evidence that we have that there are 4 distinct environments recorded in the glaciogenic rocks in the succession. First of all, subaqueous environments, both ice distal and ice proximal, terrestrial ice marginal environments, subglacial environments, and then progressial tectonics. So let's look in turn at these, the evidence for these different environments. So first of all, subaqueous environments. Now, as I said before, some workers, particularly Nick Isles and Caroline Isles and their co-workers, have argued that all of the Port Askaig Formation is glacial-marine, and some of it undoubtedly is. So perhaps the most obvious indicator of glacial or subaqueous glaciogenic sedimentation is the presence of dropstones within laminated siltstones. And here are some examples of that. A nice dropstone from the top of member 2 shown here, with downwarped beds beneath and draped lamination over the top. And in the main picture there, a succession of laminated siltstones containing dropstones in association with D25 on the island of Ahuli. Now, if we move to a different part of the succession, this is the so-called disrupted beds on Ahuli, which provide evidence for shifting glacial marine environments from ice distal to ice proximal and back again, capped with evidence of grounded ice. Now, this is an ortho image created from the drone imagery. So by flying the drone back and forth across the exposure, building up a 3D model of the exposure, and then rotating that model to view the rocks directly down dip, this view is obtained. Now, this is an orthographic projection, so the far away parts of the image are at the same scale as the nearby one. So this gives us a true picture of the thickness of beds and the architecture of the deposit. And armed with a printout of this image, going into the field and annotating that, we can then identify different facies associations within the outcrop, and finishing up here with a field log. And what this shows is a transition from conglomerates with thin sand interbeds at the base, interpreted as subaqueous outwash. On top of that, shown in a sort of blue color here, stratified diamictite consisting of thin diamictite beds interlaminated with sand and silt, lots and lots of far-traveled erratics in there. And then shown in green, distal subaqueous sediments in the form of laminated siltstones with dropstones and diamictite pellets within it. And then the succession repeats itself in reverse, with the laminated diamictites, sands and gravel sheets representing subaqueous outwash, and then finally a subglacial till over the top. And so this succession represents advances and retreats of ice and the overriding of ice of the locality through time. Now, the disrupted beds themselves have actually have been at the forefront of this debate between grounded ice and subaqueous deposition. And previous interpretations of the curious structures within the disrupted beds have ranged from the impact of subglacial shearing in a paper that I did with Tony Prey back in 2006, to gravity-induced deformation as proposed by Emmanuel Arnault. Now, our more recent detailed work on the disrupted beds have shown that the distinctive inclusions of dolomite within it are actually the result of early diagenesis and dolomitization of glacial marine sediments. So the deformation in the disrupted beds is largely diagenetic, with localized evidence for minor slumping, and there are some mass flow units within that. So in terms of the debate about the origin of the rocks within the Port Askaig Formation, I've come round to the view proposed by Emmanuel Arnault and Nick Isles about these beds being glacial marine in origin, essentially, but the key difference is that the disruption is largely the result of dolomitization during diagenesis and not due to some other process disrupting and boudinaging pre-existing dolomite beds. Okay, so we'll move on now to look at the evidence for terrestrial ice marginal environments. Now, the presence of periglacial horizons, things like involutions, frost-shattered clasts, frost wedges, and so on, indicates subaerial exposure at a number of levels throughout the Port Askaig Formation, or at least through members 1 to 3. And in amongst that, there are 3 clear instances of terrestrial ice marginal deposition. And some examples are shown here in these pictures. In the main diagram, we see kind of complexly interbedded sand and diamictic lenses occupying kind of channeled forms, cross-cutting each other. That is rather typical of ice marginal deposits in places like Iceland or Svalbard today. And in the picture bottom right, we can see that this contains angular flakes of siltstone that I'm just outlining here within this poorly sorted kind of diamictic lens-shaped body within the succession. And this we interpret, following Catherine Rose's initial work on this, as the reworking of sediment containing frost-shattered fragments. So we've got evidence of various subaerial processes and reworking processes going on in an environment very, very close to an ice margin. And the third example is this marvelous unit exposed on the small island of Sker Lethachuan. And in the middle here is a unit of coarse, class-supported, crudely stratified diamictic material, which is laterally extensive over many, many tens of meters, sitting on top of and partially inside into glacial fluvial sediments, and capped with some more sands and siltstones, and then a subglacial traction till. Picture top right, me and Dave Evans standing beside the unit at its thickest. Bottom left, showing how it tapers and thins eastward in the exposure. And this we interpret as a series of subaerial debris flows shed off of an ice margin and deposited in a immediately proglacial environment. The glacier wasn't very far away, and after a short interval, a subglacial till was deposited over the top of the ice marginal succession. Now, although I've described these examples of terrestrial ice marginal deposition, I have to point out that they are rare in the Port Askaig Formation. Many tills are directly overlain by periglacial horizons, frost shattering, thin gravel or sand deposits directly on top of the tills, or subaqueous sediments. And this implies that actually there was little or no endglacial and superglacial debris in the glaciers at that time, so that as deglaciation happened, following a glacier advance, the tills were not blanketed by superglacial or endglacial sediments. Okay, so we can now move on to look at the evidence for grounded ice in the Garvellachs. Now, many of the diamictites appear massive and structureless throughout much of their outcrop, that often there's lichen on it, or it's weathered in such a way as you can't really see the fine detail. And when you have a structureless massive diamictite, it can be very, very hard to assign an origin to that material. But again, guided by Tony Spencer, we've been able to visit outcrop throughout the island chain, and almost all of the diamictites have at least one superb outcrop where one can see exquisitely preserved detail. And many of the diamictites, not all of them, but many of them have features diagnostic of subglacial deposition and deformation. So let's look at some examples of that. So here is a fine example from D33 on a small skerry that's part of the island chain. It's one of the very smallest of the islands. And in the upper part of this picture, we have a massive diamictite, D33. And here at the base of the diamictite is a boulder pavement. And so you can see that there's an almost continuous line of clasts. They're kind of oriented in a sub-horizontal position. Those clasts are sub-rounded in shape, typically subglacially transported shapes. And features of this kind, a boulder pavement at the base of a diamictite, are formed at a subglacial interface, at a glacier bed, where ice is sliding over the substrate and clasts are lodging into the substrate and being shaped and oriented by the overriding ice. And then a till has built up, has been accreted over the top of that boulder pavement. Now, beneath the boulder pavement, it says here, deformed sandstones. Let's have a close look at those. And this is immediately below the boulder pavement. And we can see here is this kind of sock fold. There is a thrust. And there are a variety of thrust, shear, and folding structures within this sandstone. And in combination, the presence of a massive diamictite, very laterally extensive unit with a boulder pavement and then deformed sandstones underneath gives us very, very good evidence that we're looking here at the action of grounded ice. Here is a feature a little bit more subtle, and in this picture here, we can see that there's a line of boulders here, which are stacked up one against each other. And features like this are actually rather common on glacier forelands, like in Iceland, where boulders are dragged along beneath the glacier and then lodge against an obstruction. And it's not at all uncommon to find 2 or 3 or more boulders all stacked up in a line. And the picture here, bottom right, shows 2 boulders caught in the act of making one of these structures. This is the Glacier Periglacial in southern Iceland. Here is a lodged boulder. And here is a second boulder, which has been dragged along beneath the glacier and is lodging against the first boulder. So again, this is evidence of subglacial lodgement occurring within this till, D38 in this case. And the alignment of the boulders gives us a clue as to the ice flow direction at that time. Here's another structure with a boulder in association with these folded sands within a diamictite. You can see massive diamictite below and above the boulder horizon there. And here are other examples. This is from the basal till above the debris flow unit in Scairlethachuan. Here is the till. Here are the subjacent sediments, and in the boundary zone, there is abundant evidence for shearing of the sediments. And here, shown in greater detail in the top right, is a boulder that has been plowed into those subjacent sediments. A bit further along the same outcrop, a boulder pavement, and again, evidence of deformation of the subjacent sediments, indicating plowing of those boulders. A feature which occurs at some horizons within the Port Askaig Formation is we interpret as hydrofracture fills. In other words, fractures within subglacial sediment created by pressurized water, which has then been infilled with sorted sediments. And some examples in association with D31 here. Here is a wedge structure filled with sandstone, penetrating downwards into sands and silts that are beneath D31. On another island, here is another wedge below the same till horizon. And in this case, it's got a rather more complex shape. And we can see there, it has penetrated downwards And there's just little patches of D31 preserved at this particular locality. And the wedge isn't just a simple vertical crack, but it jinks and goes along a bedding plane. It then transgresses to a lower level. And this is typical of hydrofractures formed in subglacial environments today. And these wedges are quite different to the polygonal wedge networks that occur at a number of levels within the succession. And this is an example here shown on Holy Island on D22. And these are simple vertical or subvertical wedges forming polygons, rather typical of frost cracks, the infilling of frost cracks, such as we find in modern day periglacial environments such as Svalbard. This is a raft within D31. So this is the till that overlies those hydrofracture horizons. A great lump of dolomitized sand that's been rafted into the diamictite and folded. And so we have a range of features here. The tills, deformation structures, hydrofracturing rafts that together strongly point to a subglacial environment and the action of grounded ice. Okay, so glacier tectonics, the final of the process environments that I want to talk about today, occurs at a number of levels and is very, very well developed at perhaps 2 or 3 levels within the succession. This is the lowermost of them associated with D31. And in the main picture here, these beds are actually folded beds of a thin brecciated dolomite, which is repeated 2 or 3 times across the outcrop. And careful mapping of this outcrop has shown that the sediments above and below it are actually dislocated rafts. So the large dislocated rafts of the underlying Garvellach formation, the Periglacial formation, and they've been shunted along on a plane of weakness provided by this dolomite horizon, which has become brecciated and folded in the process. Beneath the lowermost raft, here is a series of isolated bodies of a sandstone bed, recording boudinage of a competent sandstone and deformation of weaker siltstones in association with those glacier tectonics. Here, perhaps not so apparent in this photograph, but there's a kind of a sock fold there in siltstones beneath D31. So again, a range of structures that together point strongly to tectonics. Now, the best developed example of glacier tectonics within the Port Askaig Formation is D13, the Great Breccia. And this is one of our drone ortho photos of the Great Breccia unit on Holy Isle. Within the Great Breccia, as has been recognized by previous workers, there are 2 main facies occurring within the Great Breccia. First of all, there are rafts, which large blocks of sediments from beneath the Port Askaig, sometimes tens of meters across. And then there is what we call the sheared boulder facies. So let's look at both of these things in turn. So first of all, rafts, I've outlined one of the rafts there with the box. And if we zoom into that, we can see that this is layered sediments in a block, obviously a dislocated raft of material. If we then look at the shear boulder facies, this is here further up section, and again zooming in. And this consists of a series of blocks. These are all individual clasts, predominantly pieces of dolomite that occur within an anastomosing network of finer grained material interpreted as sheared material. So let's look at some very well-developed examples of this. This is a series of rafts on a coulee exposed on the rock platform. This is a map view. It's not looking down dip. And here we can see these folded rafts, and in between them, shear planes where individual pieces of the rafts have been shunted and moved over each other. And the stratigraphy within these rafts can be matched, have been matched by Ian Fairchild with the underlying Garvellach formation exposed further east in the islands. Underneath this zone of rafts is an area of highly attenuated fragments of sediment, again within this anastomosing network of shears, and this is interpreted as the basal failure plane over which the whole shebang has been transported. Also on a coulee, the sheared boulder facies, and so here we can see individual blocks of dolomite, and in between is a matrix of finer material from gravel to sand to silt, and within that matrix one can find structures like this indicative of shearing of that matrix. So when we look at it close to, we can see evidence that this material has been sheared. Now, it's been very difficult until now to get an overview of the structure of the sheared boulder facies. This is a typical section. This is the cliff section. The previous photograph was that bit, showing what we can actually access in the field. This is the top of the Great Breccia here. So there's a lot of cliff that you can't actually access. So enter the drone again. This picture here is a drone orthophoto looking down dip at that cliff section on a coulee, showing the sheared boulder facies. And so again, annotating that, we can pick out the individual fragments and also shear zones where there's finely comminuted material and various kind of anastomosing structures indicative of shear. And so when we examine this, it's clear that some accumulations of fragments are disaggregated rafts. Others appear to be isolated blocks that have been sheared along. And overall, this appears to be broken rafts over which material has been sheared. And typically, we find that the raft zone and the sheared boulder facies, where they occur together, the sheared boulder facies are on the top, the rafted horizon is at the bottom, which is consistent with proglacial tectonics followed by subglacial tectonics. And it's actually the other way around from what you would expect to find in a slope failure context, where the most highly strained part of a slope failure is at the bottom, with passively rafted material sitting on top of that. Because in a glacial context, the shear zone of the glacier is on top of this, that the ice would have been on top of here. Now, by far the finest and the best well-known glacier tectonic structure, or structure interpreted as glacier tectonic in the Garvellach Islands, is the feature locally known as the bubble. And this is a large intraformational fold occurring within the Great Breccia. So again, this is a drone orthophoto. So this has been built up from the drone surveys. And again, annotating this, we can identify the structures of the fold, series of listric thrusts running along the fold axes and along the base of the folded raft, the basal decollement zone, and the sheared boulder facies sitting on the top of the whole thing. And this compares very, very clearly with glacier tectonic structures in quaternary examples, in this case from North Norfolk. The main picture here, this is examples recorded by Burke et al. 2009, showing this raft overlying a thrust fault with folded structures, very, very similar in overall form to what we find in the bubble. And then on the left, this example with these Augen-shaped blocks of chalk separated by an anastomosing system of shears and so on, directly analogous to the sheared boulder facies, supporting the interpretation that we're looking here at proglacial tectonics followed by glacial overriding. And bringing all this together, there is evidence for 15 horizons where there are multiple lines of evidence suggesting grounded ice or glacier tectonism. And these are summarized on this diagram here. And so what this records is 15 glacier advances and retreat cycles. So multiple glacier advance retreat cycles throughout the succession, and the intervening periods when the ice withdrew being either terrestrial or marine, depending on the local influences on marine base level at each time in the succession. So to summarize then, there is a long and rich record of environmental changes captured within the diamictites and associated beds in the Port Askaig Formation, recording grounded and floating ice, and importantly, a dynamic glacial environment with glaciers responding to climatic influences, recording stadial interstadial fluctuations, but also glacial interglacial fluctuations within the overall glacial event recorded by the Port Askaig. All right, thank you very much for your attention.
It's a pleasure to be with you, virtually at least. By way of introduction, my name is Richard Waller, and within this session, which is jointly authored by myself, Michael Hambury, and by Tony Spencer, we'll be focusing on the evidence for periglacial processes within the Port Askaig Tillite Formation. So by way of a quick overview, what we want to do in this session is to look at or provide an introduction of modern periglacial environments and processes for those of you who are maybe not familiar with these kinds of environments. Then briefly look at the stratigraphic setting of the periglacial phenomena that we've identified in the Garvellachs. Then look systematically through the evidence for different types of periglacial phenomena and the associated periglacial processes. Then look at an illustration, an example of a periglacial facies association to look at the ways in which these phenomena occur in combination, before having a short summary at the end where we talk about the periglacial paleoenvironments that we envisage during the Cryogenian. So for those of you who are not familiar with modern day periglacial environments, then periglacial environments are generally cold and arid environments which are associated with a combination of ground freezing and thawing, which occurs within what's known as the active layer. The active layer is that the surface of these environments, it undergoes seasonal freezing and thawing within that zone, and we'll look at the products of that in a moment. And then below that, what you tend to get is this perennially frozen ground, which is below 0 degrees C for at least 2 years, which is where we get permafrost. And permafrost, as is highlighted by this quotation from Troy Payway, who said permafrost is the common denominator of the periglacial environment. It's practically ubiquitous in the active periglacial zone. So within periglacial environments, permafrost and permafrost related phenomena are particularly common. So if we look at the modern day distribution of permafrost within the Northern Hemisphere, this is a polar projection, here's the North Pole. These purple areas highlight the modern day distribution of permafrost throughout large parts of Canada, Alaska, Russia and Siberia in particular. and then we can see extensions into China and then down into the Tibetan Plateau. And if we look at these kinds of periglacial environments, then there are a range of distinctive processes and phenomena that occur within these settings. Within the surface active layer, which is associated with seasonal freezing and thawing, you can get frost action and rock shattering. You can get cryotubation and the mobilization of material related to freezing and thawing to create involutions and patterned ground. You can get mass movement, distinctive mass movement processes in relation to frost creep and gelifluction. And then within the permafrost environment itself, in particular, something that we'll be focusing on is thermal contraction cracking that in particular occurs during the winter months where there's a rapid drop in temperatures. That causes the thermal contraction of the ground surface. Then that can infill with water if it's present to produce ice wedges. Or, as is more commonly the case, as we'll see in the Port Askaig Formation, it can fill with sand to produce sand wedge casts. And in providing a connection with the previous talk by Doug Ben, then the presence of permafrost in particular and can interact with ice sheets. If an ice sheet overrides and interacts with and deforms that permafrost, it can have an influence on the nature of the features that are created, enabling and promoting, for example, the mobilization of large bedrock rafts, and also creating or producing coarse-grained intraclasts that can occur within the deformation tills, and we'll look at that in more detail later in the talk. But to provide you with a bit of a pictorial guide through some of these phenomena within modern day environments, within the active layer, where you've got seasonal freezing and thawing taking place, that can lead to widespread bedrock disaggregation or disintegration to produce things like block fields. Here's an example in Finland. You can get cryotubation to produce these distinctive features known as patterned ground. Here's a lens cap for scale, and you can see that you've got this mixture of coarse grained domains and finer grained domains in the middle. And then also mass movement deposits and gelifluction to produce these solifluction lobes that you can see within this mountainside in Arctic Norway. We can also get the formation of larger masses of ground ice below the surface, which can form. Here's a large body of so-called massive ice below the surface in the Western Canadian Arctic, which can then degrade if it becomes exposed to generate what's known as thermokarst, and in this case producing these mass movement events flowing down these valleys. And we can also then get the connections between ice sheets and permafrost. If we've got an ice sheet overriding and interacting with permafrost, particularly around the marginal regions, then something in particular to highlight here is the impact it can have on deformation. If you get the deformation of partially frozen material around the margin of the ice sheet, that can lead, for example, to the ripping up, but the preservation of these sand intraclasts within the deformation tills. Moving on to consider the stratigraphy of the periglacial phenomena, then we can see from this summary image illustrating the stratigraphic setting of the periglacial phenomena we'll look at in more systematic detail in the next part of the talk, that the periglacial horizons occur throughout the sequence. They are particularly common within members 2 and 3, and you can see the symbols here illustrate the stratigraphic occurrences of different types of evidence in the form of the sandstone wedges, of cryotubations, of frost-shattered stones, for example. In the majority of cases, the evidence occurs at the upper contacts of the diamictite units. And an important thing to note is that within a number of these settings, the upper parts of the diamictite units, and we can see, in, for example, a horizon we'll focus on later on, D22, there are multiple lines of evidence for periglacial conditions, in this case, both in the form of sandstone wedges which form polygonal networks and associated with involutions and associated with frost-shattered stones. And that's something which Mike will look at towards the end as part of the periglacial facies associations. And if we look at again the evidence for the potential evidence for periglacial conditions in tabular form, so these are illustrated along the top here, the different types of wedges through downfolds, crust fracturing, etc. These are the things that we'll be looking at in the next session. That they occur in multiple locations, and within individual stratigraphic horizons, you'll tend to find the same phenomena will be exposed in a number of different locations where that stratigraphic horizon is also exposed. In this third and main part of the talk, we'd like to provide a more systematic consideration of the features we consider to be potentially illustrative of periglacial processes and conditions within the Port Askaig Formation. So I will talk initially about the wedges and sedimentary vein-like features before Mike will then take over and talk about downfolds, clast fracturing, sandstone intraclasts in various different settings, and frost-shattered regolith and the gelifluctite. So there's a variety of different lines of evidence that are potentially all consistent with periglacial environments. So starting by looking at the wedges and sedimentary vein-like features, there are a variety of different examples that we'll go through. Looking at the first one in terms of the complete polygonal networks, these are the most dramatic examples and the ones about which we're most confident in terms of a periglacial interpretation. If we look at this sort of quotation here from this paper by Black 1976, it says fossil ice and sand wedges are the most diagnostic and widespread indicators of permafrost, but identification is difficult and any single wedge is untrustworthy. And certainly within Pleistocene sequences or Quaternary sequences, when you're looking at things in cross-section, you might only see those individual wedges. But in the case of the Garvellachs, then what you have are these beautiful exposures on the upper surface of the diamictites, which illustrates these beautiful polygonal networks of these sand wedges. Here's Tony for scale. Here you can see them more close here. Here are the sand wedges occurring within the host diamictite unit. And some students from Aberystwyth did some fabulous mapping work on these a few years ago, and you can see how these illustrate the polygonal networks associated with this particular type of sand wedge, and these are really well exposed in D22, but also occur are also associated with other diamictite units, including extending from D26 to D15. And the polygonal networks associated with the cracking is very similar, certainly in terms of plan form, to that seen within modern day periglacial and permafrost environments, as you can see here with this Google Earth image of Alaska North Slope. And this is a similar area, but an aerial photograph. Again, you can see the polygonal networks here, and these are all related to thermal contraction cracking. But one interesting and noteworthy difference is that the polygonal networks in these modern day examples are typically somewhere between 5 and 20 meters. That's the width of the polygonal nets, whereas in the Garvellachs it can be anywhere between sort of 1 or 2 meters, so much smaller nets. So that's something which needs further consideration, although within the literature it highlights that the polygon size can be determined by things like the characteristics of the substrate, the freezing regime and the rate of cooling, and also the age of the surface and therefore the number of cracking events. So there are ways in which those smaller nets could be explained. In the upper surface of places like D22, then the sandstone wedges are also associated with a gravel lag, in which the lag itself, or the clasts within that, are much more angular than the clasts that are contained within a diamictite unit. And this diagram here shows the angularity. So this is looking at the percentage of clasts which are angular or very angular. And you can see within this gravel conglomerate at the surface, there is a much higher level of angularity than within the host diamictite that we see as being consistent with cryogenic weathering and frost shattering at the surface of those diamictite units, which is something that Mike will talk about in a moment in more detail related to frost shattered stones. If we look at these features in cross section, then you can see here's one of the sand wedges here in cross section in the Garvellachs. Maximum thickness at the top about 25 centimeters, but tapering down, and they're anywhere between about 2 to 3 meters in depth. And here are just some illustrations. This is the base of a modern day ice wedge within a tunnel in Alaska. You can see this tapering downwards profile. And here's an ice wedge pseudomorph located within North Norfolk. So that sort of vertical profile and the tapering base again is characteristic. But in particular, if we think about these as sand wedges, then a number of these sand wedges actually display these distinctive laminations or sand veins within the infill of that wedge, which is very similar to the laminations that you expect to see within modern day sand wedges. This is a modern day sand wedge located within the Canadian Northwest Territories. And it's interesting that it's sand wedges in particular, so these are thermal contraction cracks that have been infilled with sand, show a much greater potential for preservation within the geological record. There are some variations or different types of wedges. This one, which is nicknamed or referred to as the fat wedge, a sandstone wedge located above D24, rather than being sort of 20-25 centimeters in thickness, this is over a meter in thickness, and hence the term fat wedge. But one feature this does illustrate is that on either side of the wedge, the bedding within the siltstone has been deformed upwards, and that deformation of the surrounding host materials as a periglacial wedge widens over time is again something which is characteristic of these features within modern day environments. There are obviously other mechanisms that can be associated with the formation of sandstone wedges, and there are a number of sort of like locations where there are sandstone filled, what we see as sandstone filled hydrofractures. You can see this example here, which comes from some deformed siltstones and extends up through these dolomitic sandstone beds, and you can see it following the beds, taking this rather sort of circuitous route in other places, basically extending steeply upwards through those units, and that's seen as relating to hydrofracturing. And hydrofracturing has been frequently referred to within these kinds of glaciogenic sequences, and so here's just an image from a paper taken by a paper by Denis et al. In 2010, where they described these clastic dikes and these sandstone infills that were associated with what they saw as being overpressurization within an overlying subglacial shear zone, which was then associated with the formation of extensional joints, and then the injection of sand by hydrofracturing to produce these sand wedges or clastic dikes. And there are also some other features which are still somewhat enigmatic, and that we are continuing to investigate further. Other wedges where you've got some triple junctions, but you've got these bifurcating tips to them. You can see these examples here, and also when seen in cross section, there is some evidence of a greater degree of sorting of the infill. You can see with this granule gravel here. And also, if we look at this site D15, then again we have triple junctions within the sandstone wedges here, which again are hosted within diamictite. But then there are locations where there appears to be fragmentation of the wedges, and other situations where that wedge infill appears to have been displaced.
The next group of sedimentary structures we believe are the consequence of cryotubation or frost reordering. They are downfolds of gravel and sand, as this photograph shows. The outline of these structures is shown in chalk here and here. You can see the downfold structure here. This is a plan view of these involutions, denoted by the rough circular arrangement of concentrations of clasts, as in here. These circular arrangements you can see very clearly just here. While in vertical section, over here, you can see the depth to which the cryotubation occurs, which in this particular case is about 1 metre. Also, to demonstrate the role of frost action on the clasts, we have recorded roundness in 2 locations, one shown in blue, the other shown in orange, and the Powers roundness values are shown on the bottom axis, very angular, angular, sub-rounded, and so on. You can see that the majority of the clasts tend towards the angular end of the Powers roundness spectrum. We interpret these features as periglacial involutions, as they closely resemble structures that are common in quaternary glaciogenic sequences. The crude sorting of clasts occurs in the active layer as a result of annual freezing and thawing. We now have a look at clast fracturing. The evidence of fractured clasts is widespread in diamictites, especially on bedding surfaces. Here is a selection of granite clasts in various stages of disintegration in diamictite 35. At top left here, the fractured clasts are associated with sand wedges. Sand wedges here, and fractured clasts on the surface of this bed of diamictite. At bottom right, we see a fractured clast that is actually bent, suggesting that this was deformed during deposition. We interpret the host sediment as basal till, or more accurately, subglacial traction till, in which frost shattering occurs within the till layer, as well as on the exposed upper surface with periglacial sand wedge formation. Here is a selection of other frost shattered clasts in a lower diamictite, D22, which includes dolomite and quartzite. You can see the fractured clasts in all these cases. Again, we interpret the host sediment as a subglacial traction till, with this being a surface that was exposed to the air. Here's some other evidence of frost action. Here we have sandstone intraclasts in gravel. These intraclasts of sandstone occur within a conglomerate. The pinkish clasts dispersed through this matrix of rounded granite cobbles, we interpret these clasts as a product of riverbank collapse. This is close to the riverbank. You can see the large angular clasts of sandstone, and the fact that these have survived in effectively a gravel bed river implies that they were frozen when they were incorporated and the banks collapsed. At the lower right here, there's a second example, here comprising grey sandstone intraclasts, here and here, all scattered through this particular deposit. These were discovered by Catherine Rose and also correctly identified as having been incorporated as frozen blocks. We now consider how glacial processes interact with periglacial processes. Firstly, we have identified sandstone intraclasts in diamictites. In this example, Dave Evans suggested that these extra large clasts were ripped up from the underlying sandstone bed, which is over here. And this took place with a glacier passing over this sandstone bed and depositing the till. So these clasts were originally frozen sand blocks, and they were incorporated into the basal till in which this clast is hosted. It's a process common in modern and quaternary environments. This is an example of a frozen sand block that's incorporated into basal till from Siberia. So this is a common process associated with quaternary sediments. We also see the impact of glaciotectonism on a substrate that's been affected by periglacial processes. In this particular pair of photographs we have sandstone downfolds. Here's an example here, and another one over here and here. But these have been deformed presumably by overriding ice. We could see various shear structures running through the sediment here and also over here. Next we come to breccia deposits, essentially angular clasts, which we interpret as frost-shattered regolith. This is something rather different from what we've seen up to now, and this is mainly confined to one horizon at the top of the Great Breccia, but it is actually widespread through the Garvellach Islands and represents a good marker horizon. This is it here. And here in close up. We've also analysed the class roundness of 3 samples, and again the 3 samples in different colours, very angular, angular, subangular, and you can see that these clasts tend towards the angular end of the Powers roundness spectrum. This deposit is equivalent to the modern deposit called jelly fluctate, which Doug Benn recognised. We call it here jelly fluctite to indicate it's the lithified equivalent. The last bit of brecciation is again something rather different. It's not actually in the glacial sequence itself. This is actually a brecciated horizon near the top of the Periglacial Garvellachs Formation, just before the first true glaciogenic deposits occur. This would be close to our proposed Cryogenian low boundary. Ian Fairchild has already mentioned this occurrence. So how do all these fit together? Well, we have essentially looked at various periglacial facies associations. In fact, we've created several detailed logs of periglacial facies associations, but I think this field sketch makes it easier to explain some of the key attributes. Here we have a 4 metre thick succession where the spatial relationships of facies can be determined. The sequence includes 3 diamictite beds, D21A, D21B, and D22 here, here, and here. So the sequence with 3 diamictite beds is actually capped by a gravel bed over here, followed by a dolomitic sandstone. So this is a facies association which shows many of these features remarkably well. The diamictites were deposited as subglacial traction tills here, here, and here. And the top of 2 of them, top of D21B, have been influenced by periglacial action. So here we have sandstone downfolds here and here, and again up here and here. And these are the periglacial involutions, which we have talked about already. And in addition, there are also sand wedges. Here's 3 wedges on this particular, in this particular diamictite. Note how the wedges have been rotated into the plane of cleavage to a varying degree. So we've got this cleavage here running through, fairly intermittent, but shows that relationship quite well. So here we have a summary of our periglacial environment in the Port Askaig Formation. The formation is remarkably rich in features that indicate periglacial conditions, often in close proximity to a glacier or ice sheet margin. The ice sheet margin was dynamic, fluctuating back and forth across the area of investigation. We also envisage a low relief proglacial area dominated by till deposition with lesser amounts of glaciofluvial and glacioaquatic sedimentation. We have recorded short time scale processes on a scale of years. These are frost-shattered stones, frozen riverbank collapse, and hydrofracturing. Then we have longer term processes representing decades or hundreds of years. These are the sand wedges and cryotubation structures. And also thinking about modern analogues, the closest we come to are represented by high Arctic or Antarctic types of climate. With this final picture from Svalbard in the Norwegian high Arctic, the processes which produce the features in the Port Askaig Formation are found in such a glacier foreland. So, for example, a till plain dissected by glacier-derived streams with reworking of till to sand and gravel. Further back we have thrust moraine complexes and glacial tectonism, which Doug Ben has already talked about. So these are the features that we find in the Port Askaig Formation on a glacier foreland, although without the mountains that you see in the background. So we've envisaged then, in summary, a high Arctic or Antarctic type of climate. This is what we envisage for the Port Askaig Formation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dilshad Omar Ali. During my presentation, I'm going to talk about identifying detailed events, example of glacial to periglacial to non-glacial change above diamictite 26. During my presentation, I'm going to talk about field photographs of cryoturbated bed in one slide, field sketch in one slide, and then digitizing field sketch in one slide, correlation and identification of 9 events in one slide, wheeler diagram in one slide, and finally periglacial horizon in member 1, 2, 3 in one slide. So my presentation includes only 6 slides. First of all, how this horizon can be seen in the field. In the field, you can see the horizon like this. Photos, we can see it. The two top photos are identical. The only difference is the right hand side is marked by chalk to show the involuted structure, while the left hand side is not. By focusing and in closer view, we can see clearly the involution structure here. I am using the mouse pointer to point on the photos or on the slides. By closer view, in the bottom right side of the photos, we can see the involution structure here. The ruler is 1 meter for scale. In the field, we graded the outcrop, the whole outcrop, to squares. Each square is half a meter, so 2 squares is 1 meter. Then we sketch exactly how the outcrop looks like by the scale, of course. After that, in the office, we used a computer to digitize the sketch which we made in the field. Making this kind of sketch for each outcrops through the Garvellachs Islands, at least 12 localities, and using sedimentary logs, we can produce a correlation, stratigraphic correlation between the whole outcrops. The field sketch labeled A here, it is the same they have just seen in the last 2 slides, and is the detailed stratigraphy of the East Garvellachs column at the left here. Now I am going to explain and make use of the stratigraphy in all 12 outcrops of the top of diamectite 26 in the Garvellachs. You can see here the scale or thickness, and at the top localities. The first event is deposition of diamectite 26 here. Then we have an irregular surface at the top of diamectite 26, which is represented by non-deposition or time gap. Then we have formation of sandstone wedge, the yellow triangle representing the sandstone wedge at the top of diamectite 26. Then deposition of the package between diamectite 26 and diamectite 26- here on the east coast of Akuli. Then deposition of diamectite 26-. The difference between diamectite 26- and diamectite 26 is diamectite 26- is laminated, while diamectite 26 is massive. After that, deposition of conglomerate above diamectite 26-, which is represented by pink color. Then formation of sandstone with involuted structure, which we used this horizon as a datum to correlation because it's continuous through the whole Garvellach Islands. Then deposition of pebbly sandstone at the top of the involuted sandstone bed. Then deposition of pebbly granitic conglomerate at the east coast of Garvellachs at the top of pebbly sandstone. Now you can see at least 9 events in only about 7.5 meter thickness. This 7.5 thickness is very thin compared with the thickness of the core formation, which is more than 1 kilometer thick. Preserving these events makes Garvellach and this location and the formation extraordinary by fantastic preservation. We can use this correlation and these events to produce a Wheeler diagram. So Wheeler diagram for presenting the representing the gap between the beds. So the gray color is unexposed or non-deposition. Using the same localities, the same outcrops, and the same logs to produce a Wheeler diagram. So the first is deposition of diamectite 26. Second event is a gap. Third event, formation of the sandstone wedge. Fourth, deposition of the package between diamectite 26 and diamectite 26-. Fifth, deposition of the diamectite 26-. Sixth event is deposition of the conglomerate. Seventh, the deposition of the involuted sandstone. And 8th and 9th, deposition of the package at the top of involuted sandstone and deposition of the conglomerate. I have shown how the wonderful outcrops in the Garvellachs have allowed us to distinguish 9 events related to just one of these periglacial horizons at the top of diamectite 26. Just at the top of diamectite 26. This horizon or this periglacial horizons are not the only horizon on the top of diamectite 26. It's possible to make similar analysis of many of the other periglacial horizon, which we have at least 25 periglacial horizon in the Garvellach, in member 1, 2, and 3 in the Garvellach. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Dilshad. That was very illuminating and a lovely little talk about a sort of detailed part of the work you've been doing on the Garvellachs. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start the question session for the next wee while. I just wanted to just take first of all Graham Leslie's comment. Graham is a geologist, knows the Highlands geology very well from the BGS in Edinburgh. It's really a question relating to session 1, but I wanted to, session A, but I wanted to just cover it first and get it over with quickly, because I think there's something, we could have a whole day talking about the age of the Dalradian. So I'm hoping that Tony and Roger may just comment a bit on Graham's His view in being that to deposit all the Grampian group and the Appin group in the time gap between 800 million years and the Sturtian at 720, there's not enough time to get all that stuff in there. So he is throwing some doubt stratigraphically on the Sturtian age based on the stratigraphy of the Dalradian. Tony, have you got any comments on that? You're muted, Tony.
It is a subject of great interest, obviously. It is a pity that there are so few dates in the Dalradian. We are trying to do something about that. There is a student in Stockholm who might succeed in producing some dates, but we note Graham's concerns with interest is the thing to say.
Roger, are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Did you read the comment from Graham? Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on what you think the ages are, but in rough terms, if the Port Askaig is round about 700, and if we've got round about 100 million years between that and the base of the Dalradian, that's quite a long time. I suspect, from what we've seen on the offshore stuff around the Garvellachs, that where the Garvellachs succession is thick on the Garvellachs, the underlying Appin group is actually relatively thin, only a few kilometres. So it depends where you measure your thicknesses. So there's such a complex lateral relationships in the Dalradian where you get this lateral compensation effect. So a thick unit in one place passes laterally into a thin unit at the same horizon, and the units above and below, do the opposite. So I don't really think that there is a huge problem. I mean, the total thickness of the Dalradian in any one place, just from an understanding of basic basin evolution, can't be much more than 10 kilometres, because once you get to a sedimentary basin 10 kilometres thick, you kind of thinned away the whole of the continental crust. So this sort of 20-25 kilometre figure that we all have in our heads, I think is a bit of a red herring. It's not really the thickness at one place. So although if you look at the cross section I showed earlier, the Port Askaig tillite is shown as being 10 or 12 kilometres above the base of the Dalradian on that diagram. Actually, how much pre-Port Askaig Dalradian there was underneath it could have been more like 5 kilometres, or rather than that huge great thickness. So if you look at the kind of thicknesses we're talking about, compared with, say, North Sea Mesozoic Tertiary substance rates, they're not large, they're quite reasonable. So Graham, I don't really think there's a problem. There's a lot of time to deposit these kilometres of material. It would be really nice, as Tony says, to have the actual dates pinned down a bit more. We've got this 600 million date at the top of the succession, where assuming that the Port Askaig is roughly 700, and we're assuming that the base, because of the radiometric dates on the stuff underlying the Dalradian, are about 800. But you can see in that there's only one firm date. Don't you agree?
I see Graham is back. Graham's shaking his head. I don't want to have a long discussion about this. As I say, it could take a day, but just a quick comment, Graham.
Yeah, I could.
Oh, Ian's there, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Does Graham want to speak?
Well, I was just going to say hello to everyone, first of all, and thank you, David, for the opportunity just to make a brief comment. As I say, I've got to be somewhere else very shortly. I think I want to stress the point that the base of the Dalradian, wherever you take it, is younger and probably significantly younger than 800. Because there are no 800 million year old ages in the base of the Dalradian. Those 800 million year old ages come from the Metamorphic Rocks, the so-called Central Highland granulites. They used to be, they're now the Badenoch group. And those are quite high-grade metamorphic rocks, or essentially granulites. They have a complex deformation record and metamorphic record that is not recorded in the basal Grampian group. So whatever age the base of the Grampian is, wherever you are, it's certainly in the Central Highlands younger, and possibly significantly younger than 800, because you've got to get those metamorphic rocks back to the surface and then deposit fluvial strata on top. So you've got about 2 kilometers measured thickness of Glen Shearer group, the Grampian group, etc., etc., etc. And what you have in any one place will certainly vary from one place to another, but there's quite a lot of strata to get in before you get to that circa 700 to sort of 620 time period. And there's actually quite a lot of removal of stratigraphy going on as well. The Dalradian is anything but layer cake. There are significant intraformational unconformities being developed at various stages. So it's not a simple and straightforward pattern, that's all I would say. But please bear in mind that the base of the Dalradian must be significantly younger, measured in a number of millions of years, or a very small number of tens of millions of years, than the oldest metamorphic or tectonometamorphic record in the basement to the Dalradian. And we can prove that now on either side of the Great Glen Fault. We're about to, colleagues are about to revise the Moyne supergroup stratigraphy. And if the youngest deformation in the equivalent rocks in the Northwest Highlands is 730, then we really do have a problem. So I'm just highlighting the problem rather than really at this stage. I haven't got any data to throw at the answer, but it would be great to get a depositional age for key stratigraphic intervals in the Dalradian, and that we don't have.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Graham. Ian, you wanted to just say something just to wrap this one up, then I can move on to the...
Yes, I mean, it's really that, I mean, those arguments are interesting, but they are indirect arguments, and the direct evidence is that the glacial deposits of the Port Askaig Formation overlie limestones with strontium isotope ratios that are very low, and any subsequent diagenetic effects or metamorphic effects will raise those values. So it's really, you really can't have the base of the Port Askaig Formation being any younger than it is, based on our global understanding of correlating strontium isotopes in unmetamorphosed successions all over the place. Now, Graham did mention that there are some slightly anomalously high values quite near the base of the Dalradian. He refers to the paper by Thomas et al. Yes, they are higher than one would expect, but they do show a range. But it's the other way around. You know, they are values that are high, that are too high, and we know that values that are too high can easily be created secondarily, whereas values that are too low, you know, can't be created that way. So it's so you know, Graham's raised this interesting question, but the question about what is the age of the Port Askaig Formation, how does it correlate with other parts of the world? It correlates with other places that have these low strontium isotope ratios, which have been dated elsewhere at around 720.
Thanks, Ian. We'll take that. We'll leave that hanging for the moment, but that's a good place to end on that discussion, and we'll move on to some stuff to do with the glacial geology. I'll take a few of these questions here. Will Frigley has asked about evidence for subglacial and glacial water erosion and depositional activity. Can either Doug or Richard or Mike give a comment on that?
Yeah, in some of the diamictites, we do see sand lenses and stringers that might represent channel fills or canal fills within the tills. But in terms of anything like tunnel valleys or major drainage systems, we don't see anything of that kind. But generally speaking, within quaternary till exposures, it's actually quite rare to find much evidence of glacial drainages. You tend to see these things more at a geomorphological scale, you know, where you get a big spatial sampling and you can see narrow features within that. But within sections, I think what we see is pretty typical of what we see in the quaternary.
Okay, thanks, Doug. There's a question here from Trevor. He's asked some other earlier questions, but I'm going to just wrap this one up about paleocasts, because I know there are thoughts about paleocasts, and I know we've seen some on Islay, I think, as well. So maybe Doug and maybe Ian can talk about paleocasts.
Yes, I could just talk about that. No, paleocast is there isn't paleocast. There is no paleocast. The climate was arid. It was arid before the Port Askaig Formation, during the Port Askaig Formation, as you heard about those arid periglacial features, and it was arid afterwards. The conditions were, the climate zone was not conducive to karst formation at all during this whole interval.
Anyone else want to talk about that?
Well, in the question about paleokarst, it mentioned it is relevant to the creation of sandstone wedge formation. So really just to reiterate that the sandstone wedges that Richard was talking about in his talk are developed in tills with a high proportion of siliciclastic material within them. So they're not the kind of material that is susceptible to solutional etching, but on the other hand, the features do have many of the characteristics of periglacial sand wedge fills, and also occur in association with other features indicative of a permafrost environment.
Yeah, that was just the thing that I was going to kind of suggest, that it's not one individual feature, which I think is sort of important in terms of considering the the environment that was occurring. It's those combination of features that occur within these associations that are sort of consistent in terms of the environment they suggest. So certainly in the kind of the situations like D22 and other horizons, the sand wedges will occur frequently in combination with frost shattered stones, and also with the involutions. So you have an assemblage of features which are consistent with that sort of thermal contraction cracking as playing a sort of key role in those settings.
Thank you, Richard. There's a question from John Islay about paleokarstic. I wonder if we've already answered it now, whether that question has probably been answered. You can come back to me, John, if you think we haven't answered the question adequately for you. Tim Holt Wilson has asked about distinguishing frozen riverbank collapse deposits from slumping on the outwash plain, like ice block melting into a kettle hole. Maybe someone can have a comment on that.
Yeah, well, although this is something that popped up in Mike's talk, I saw that question and thought it was an interesting one. Just to give a bit more context to what Mike was showing, there's basically a channel fill full of gravel within imbricated clasts within it. So it's a gravel bed river deposit, and along the flanks of that are these sand intraclasts. So it's the context of those intraclasts that tells us that we're looking at bank collapse in a river system, because you wouldn't find those kind of gravels in the bottom of a kettle hole if that was the origin of the slumping.
I can add to that as well. The channel that the riverbank collapse features occurs can be traced for tens of meters. So we know it's a linear feature. We can see the channel banks quite clearly. And there's this transition from the sides of the channel where the clasts are quite large into the middle part of the channel where the sandstone clasts are actually quite small. And they're all mixed up with the granite cobbles, which are moderately well-rounded. So they're clearly being transported by quite a powerful stream, which we assume to be close to being a stream from a glacier nearby.
Maybe I can quickly chip in as well. And in terms of sort of modern day process observations in permafrost environments, it's pretty common to see those kinds of processes at the margins of river systems within permafrost environments. you'll get the sort of thermal erosion of the banks, in addition to the mechanical erosion, which can commonly produce sort of thermo-erosional niches. You see that both within fluvial environments and coastal environments. So that's sort of undercutting the frozen materials above that, which will then sort of fail. And so you'll get sort of situations which you can get sort of then scattered blocks of that sort of, basically that permafrost which has failed, which can then be sort of incorporated into the fluvial sediments at the margin of the channel. So there's there are observations of that kind of process from modern day permafrost environments.
Okay. I'm going to pick up Hilming Bao's question for Richard while you're on there. He talked about density of the sand dike populations, Garvellachs compared with the modern environment. Can you read the question there, Richard?
Yes, I could. No, that's a really interesting point. It's an interesting idea. I think it would be in practice quite difficult to use the spacing of the polygons to identify an age, because there's a number of different parameters, I think, which can influence the diameter of those networks I alluded to. I mean, for example, within diamicts or diamictites are associated or tend to be associated with smaller polygons, for example, than sands related to, which is related in turn to their sort of thermal conductivity. So to try and sort of isolate that variable, I think will be challenging, but it's an interesting point, and certainly something which I'd be interested in giving some more thought to. I mean, within modern day environments, the age of that surface would be typically evaluated not by the width of those polygons, but by the thickness of the infill within the wedges themselves. But then that in turn would sort of depend on the sort of the sediment supply, and certainly within some really hyper environment, you have a cracking event that takes place, but then whether that infills will then depend on the amount of aeolian sediment there is within that sort of environment, which can then infill that crack that's been sort of created. But no, it's a really interesting point, and it sort of highlights the use of this event in terms of raising some interesting issues that'll be worthwhile kind of considering. So, a really interesting thing to try, but I think in practice it might be quite challenging to use that to estimate the age.
Okay, thanks, Richard, for that. I'm going to just pick up Dan Leheron's question to Doug, Richard, and Mike. Is there any remote possibility that the periglacial wedges and subglacial hydrofractures could get confused with one another?
So there certainly is a possibility that geologists could be confused in things. When we've been examining the wedge structures, we've been working with both hypotheses in our minds, and also considering other possible origins. And I think in some cases we can very confidently assign wedge structures to a periglacial origin because of the association with other periglacial features. In other cases, we can very confidently assign them to hydrofracturing because of their context. There are some features which which we're still arguing over. There are some instances where they have characteristics that could be interpreted either way. So we are still working on some of these ambiguous examples and hope to sort those out.
I just sort of add to that and say I absolutely agree that one of the first things I've got on my sort of like to-do list as we look forward to sort of like writing the memoir is that need to to consider multiple hypotheses for the origins of the sand wedges, and in particular to identify those diagnostic characteristics, and then using those diagnostic characteristics as well as those sort of fascies associations that we've talked about in order to consider the origin of those features. But I think certainly within some of the I mean, my background is primarily within the sort of quaternary and modern day environment, so it's been a an extraordinary opportunity to get involved in my first opportunity to study the pre-quaternary, any pre-quaternary sequences. And I think one of the most remarkable things that I've had to adjust myself to is that ability to see things in plan view. And then in that sort of situation, certainly related to D22 and indeed some of the other horizons, that ability to end up seeing the upper surfaces of the diamictite units, and then to see those characteristic polygonal patterns of the sand wedges, as well as their associations with parts of the involutions of the frost shattered stones, provides a pretty kind of compelling story to their origin in that broader context.
Okay.
I think we can also say that the really very well exposed examples on bedding surfaces, where you can also see the penetration downwards as well. Those networks that are so well developed in one or two places, those we are convinced that those are periglacial, but there are, as others have said, that there are some wedge-like features that split, bifurcate, and so on, and we've yet to explore those in more detail. But yes, we're working on multiple hypotheses, but for certain there is, from our perspective, there are very good examples of true periglacial wedges.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to just take one last question because we're going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. I've got one from Jane at the end here saying about deformation structures and were the periglacial features in between the tills deformed?
Yeah, hi Jane, good to see you here. One of the examples I showed in my talk of the deformed sands beneath the Boulder pavement in that feature there, the sands there seem to have undergone a phase of involution before the folding and overturning associated with glacial overriding. And also, I think Mike showed some examples of places where periglacial features have subsequently been modified by overriding glacial ice. So we find both these things. We find periglacial structures that have then been subsequently buried by non-glacial sediments and have preserved their original form, and other instances when ice has gone back over the top of them, deforming periglacial features. And I think for Jane, I just want to add the comment that nowhere in the Quaternary have I ever seen such a richness of well-exposed glacial stuff. It's an absolute paradise for a glacial sedimentologist. You really need to get yourself over there.
It looked absolutely amazing. I've always wanted to see it, and the photos you and Richard and Mike showed were just fantastic. Really good photos.
Yeah, we'll need to get you over there.
I want to go there.
Right, good.
I think that's a lovely place to finish up on. It's just a nice summary, Doug, there with Jane about how wonderful these outcrops on the Garvellachs are, and how fascinating it is for quaternary geologists to see stuff in three dimensions and so clearly exposed and preserved. So that's the end of today's talks. We're going to have another session tomorrow, starting again at 12 o'clock tomorrow. You'll probably have to use the traditional Zoom entry mechanism. I don't think the Eventbrite thing will work tomorrow because Eventbrite thinks the event has happened. So if you can use your Zoom login, email myself or Ian if you've got stuck with anything like that. I think that's all I've got to say, unless Ian or Tony want to say anything to wrap up today.
No, thank you very much, David.
Okay, guys, we'll see you all tomorrow at 12 o'clock, bright and bushy-tailed, yeah?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't I just switch off?